Thank you also to the organizers for putting this together and to Nina for chairing our panel. $150,000 in heroin labeled olive oil. Two men claiming shipment from Istanbul arrested at Brooklyn Pier, proclaimed a headline on page 4 of the Wednesday, January 6, 1932, New York Times. This, it announced, was one of the largest seizures of heroin ever made at this busy New York port. 260 pounds of heroin, the article detailed, had been concealed within tin boxes, submerged into 35 barrels of olive oil, and brought into the United States from Istanbul on the Greek steamship Byron. There, it sat unclaimed for months, which supposedly prompted the suspicion of customs officials. Two men were subsequently arrested for claiming the heroin. One was a 35-year-old man named Naftali Ojalvo, who described himself as a native of Mexico, and 43-year-old Isaac Sevilla, who claimed Spanish citizenship. The two men declared that they were innocent. Several weeks earlier, they claimed they had been in Paris, and a stranger there had asked them to call for the olive oil in Brooklyn, not informing them of the barrel's contraband contents. They were simply doing a favor for a stranger when they showed up at the Brooklyn port. And yet, much of the information presented in this article was incorrect. Customs officials in New York City did not just stumble upon the barrels filled with heroin after no one claimed them for months. Rather, they had been alerted to the possible presence of heroin on this very ship by American officials in Istanbul, which was a testament to the United States' growing preoccupation with monitoring and seizing illegal drugs before they could reach American consumers. And while Isaac Sevilla and Naftali Ojalvo might have possessed Spanish and Mexican papers respectively, they too had an Istanbul connection. Both men had been born in the city, but it was the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, and from there they migrated to Mexico. Indeed, the author of the article never mentioned, and was likely unaware of, an essential element of this particular heroin tale. The refiner in Istanbul was a Sephardi Jew. The informant in Istanbul who alerted American authorities to the shipment of heroin was a Sephardi Jew as well, and those arrested for attempting to claim and likely distribute the goods were Sephardi. So this extensive transnational smuggling network relied on and manifested an aspect of the expanding Sephardi diasporic world. Indeed, by the late 1920s, many of the states through which Sephardi individuals like Ojalvo and Sevilla moved had restricted both the importing of opium and its byproducts and, more crucially, the immigration of Jews writ large. The American 1921 Emergency Quota Act and the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act effectively ended large-scale legal Jewish immigration from countries ranging from Eastern and Central Europe to Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans. Likewise, in 1927, Mexico had suspended the entrance of immigrants of Syrian, Lebanese, Armenian, Palestinian, Arab, and Turkish origins who possessed less than 10,000 pesos on the ground that such individuals, quote, did not constitute a useful economic factor in the development of the public wealth. At the same moment, hundreds of emigres of Turkish origin, most of them were Armenian, Greek Orthodox, or Jewish, found their citizenship stripped as the Turkish state saw removing citizenship from religious minorities as a means of creating a more homogeneous Turkish national body. Thus, individuals of Turkish Sephardi origin like Sevilla, Ojalvo, and numerous others had a vested interest in adopting, or at least pretending to be, of origins other than where they were actually from. This enabled them to continue patterns of mobility that they had established in earlier years. So what I'm interested in this particular paper is looking at this one case of heroin smuggling and sort of teasing it out and seeing how the individual components fit together to look at the connection between these sort of invisible illegal flows of goods and of people that pop up at various moments, and to explore how these moments of visibility of these illegal flows shed crucial light onto how individuals contend with different geographical scales, whether the international, national, or local, and also how they deal with transforming obstacles at different points along their trajectories when the goods they sell, and indeed they themselves, become deemed illegal by some larger state or international agreement. So I'll give you a brief background of the opium trade and how it fits into this Sephardic world, and then move on from there. So the trade of opium and its byproducts was not always illegal. Indeed, it didn't start to become illegal on an international scale until 1909 at the first. For over a century before Isaac Sevilla and Naftali Ojalvo were apprehended in Brooklyn, opium was in large part, or partially a Sephardi affair. It was very connected to Sephardi Jews in the Ottoman Empire, and in particular to certain Sephardi families. This was a characteristic that did not dramatically alter over the subsequent century. Izmir, or Smyrna, which was a very cosmopolitan port city that linked Western Anatolia and its poppy fields to the broader Mediterranean and beyond, was initially the center of the Ottoman opium trade. Much like we learned with chocolate, opium also depends on the quality of the poppies and how it's prepared. And the opium poppies of Western Anatolia were particularly known for having a very high morphine content, thus making them desirable, particularly for medical refinement after morphine was synthesized in 1808 and heroin in 1898. Throughout the 19th century, Dutch exporters shipped their newly procured opium from Izmir to colonies in the Dutch East Indies, and American traders sought Turkish opium because of its high morphine content for a growing drug industry operating out of New York. International opium trade relied on Ottoman brokers who linked Anatolian farmers with American and European exporters. It also relied on Ottoman inspectors who tested the opium in exchange for a small ball of the drug, or between 0.5 and 3% of the value of the opium to be exported. Most of these inspectors were Jewish or Armenian Ottomans. And in the first half of the 19th century, the examiners of opium in Izmir were a man named Bohor Taranto and Isaac Abulafia, and they were assisted by Bohor's son Nisim Taranto and Chaim Gabai. In Salonika, which was also another large Jewish city, the Gabai family, another branch of the Gabai family, was very heavily involved in the opium export and monitoring, and the Anavi family in Sofia in Bulgaria was also similarly sort of at the intersection of this. So all of these were these large, prominent, wealthy Sephardi families, and all were Jews. In 1831, the Ottoman government instated a monopoly in the capital city of Istanbul in order to have stricter control over opium transactions, and appointed Bohor Taranto from Izmir as the official inspector for the Ottoman monopoly. So he relocated to Istanbul with his son Nisim, and the family continued to be involved in the opium trade there. By 1910, 2/3 of Constantinople's opium trade passed through the company belonging to Nisim Taranto and his sons. It's not the same Nisim Taranto, it's the grandson of the original Nisim Taranto that I mentioned. The more recent Nisim noted a 1913 French publication on opium commerce in Turkey, was one of the first to give any importance to the subject and therefore possessed the oldest laboratory in the city dedicated to that trade. Meanwhile, Isaac Abulafia and his assistants remained in Izmir, and there the Taranto, Bonomo, and Barki families also maintained opium concessions. The Tarantos in Istanbul donated a large quantity of opium every year from their personal inspectors to the Orachaim Jewish National Hospital in Istanbul. And so they were lauded in the Ladino press for supplying the Jewish hospital with quantities of opium to care for the predominantly poor Jews who went to the Orachaim Hospital. The United States became increasingly concerned over addiction, even as drug use was largely declining, and started to press for increasing international regulation in the trade of opiates. China was also pushing for regulation of the trade of opiates. And in 1909, the first international conference on opium trafficking and control was held, which marked the beginning of a series of conferences convened to stifle the trade of opiates. And the Ottoman Empire refused to take part. In 1914, the United States passed the Harrison Act, which required all dispensers of opium and its derivatives to register with the federal government. but this still allowed for opium to be imported for medicinal purposes. So we start to see opium becoming kind of illegal, but not fully illegal, and in spotty, not all over the world, but in different areas at different times. So as soon as World War I ended, Ottoman Jews and others started to emigrate en masse. And Sephardi Jews of Ottoman origins flocked to New York to establish houses of commerce. They also went throughout to Cuba, to Mexico, and throughout Latin America at this time. These businesses that the Sephardi Jews established imported Turkish and Balkan goods, including opium, into the United States, while they exported foodstuffs and machinery back across the Atlantic and indeed throughout the world. At this time, Nissim Taranto's son Leon arrived in New York as part of this this movement of Ottoman Jews out of the empire. During World War I, Leon had fled to Salonika for trade purposes, and there the Ottoman government sought to use his opium connections to connect to a well-known British opium house in order to try to informally broker peace between the Ottoman Empire and Great Britain. This did not work, as we know. But once Leon arrived in New York, he opened a business firm in Manhattan that exported flour, sugar, paper, and glassware to Constantinople and Izmir, and imported into the United States, among other Anatolian goods like pistachio nuts and mohair, opium. So opium was not entirely illegal in the US, but not fully legal. And it followed the same flow through the same Sephardi providers and distributors as fully legal goods that originated in Ottoman and formerly Ottoman lands. As progressive League of Nations dictums sought to limit the production and refinement of opiates within signatory states to meet but not surpass medical requirements, in the late 1920s, the geographies of opium refinement shifted. While Paris had been the predominant European center for the trade and refinement of opium, France's decision to shut down most of the major factories in that city forced the creation of underground laboratories in Marseille, which marked the beginning of the infamous French Connection. But at this time, the center of opiate refineries shifted east across the Mediterranean towards the fertile poppy fields of Turkey, and particularly to Istanbul. Not a member of the League of Nations, Turkey refused to take the economic blow for opiate addiction that it deemed to be an external problem, and it posed no objection to the opening of 3 large opiate refineries in Istanbul, the third of which was founded in May of 1929. It was called the Etkin Limited Şirketi, or Etkin Limited Company, that belonged to Nissim Taranto and his sons Leon and Richard and Albert and one other son whose name we only know as the letter T, as well as Isaac Taranto, who was a relative and a doctor involved with the Or HaChaim Jewish National Hospital, as well as a member of the Sephardi Lay Council for the city of Constantinople. While the Taranto's factory had the lowest official consumption of raw opium of all 3 factories, U.S. consular officials noted that as, quote, for some 30 years, one of the most important handlers of raw opium, the Tarantos had likely had access to far greater quantities of raw opium than they officially reported. So the U.S. consulate in Istanbul paid minute attention to the export of opiates, whether opium, morphine, or heroin, and regularly paid informants to reveal dates and methods of illegal shipments in an effort to prevent illegal importing into the United States, as well as into other places. So they weren't just interested in opium or its derivatives aimed for the US, but also to Mexico and Argentina. The export of illegal white drugs from Istanbul often paralleled and was indeed sometimes literally embedded within the trade of legal exports. US consular officials stationed in Turkey and Bulgaria regularly wrote to the State Department reporting that drugs were hidden within packages of furs, mohair, or more rarely, barrels of olive oil, cans of tomatoes, and hollowed out rounds of cheese. Heroin, given its smaller size and lack of odor, was easier to conceal than opium or morphine. And most of those caught for trafficking heroin were sailors or passengers with small quantities of the drug concealed in false bottom shoes or in personal luggage. So something of the scale of this opium bust in New York was notable. Exporters also forged papers and they forged bills of landing, or they, as in the case of that entrapped Sevilla and Ojalvo, they sent drugs ingeniously hidden but not addressed to a specific firm or person. And the US followed the activities of American citizens and others, including a number of Sephardi Jews, who sought to import opiates into Mexico and Argentina. So there was something called the Benjamin Cohen Express that was between Istanbul and Buenos Aires. And these could yield very large profits. So 2 shipments in June of 1930 of heroin yielded clear profits of 400%. So in 1931, August of 1931, a man named Nissim Levy wrote to the American Consul General in Istanbul that there was a ship leaving Istanbul the previous Friday that had 35 barrels of olive oil that contained a very important quantity of opium. And this came little more than a month after an unsigned report stated that another ship from Istanbul held 68 cases of soap that contained 250 kilos of heroin and 150 kilos of morphine, and another 25 barrels of olive oil containing 300 kilos of heroin. So this, basically, there's this sting operation set up to try to trap Naftali Ojalvo and Sevilla months before they actually arrived. And yet, the market for this heroin that Sevilla and Ojalvo had imported from the Toronto's firm in Istanbul was not the United States, but it was Mexico, the place where both of these men had resided for some years. Sevilla had first arrived in Mexico in 1909. He had traveled extensively throughout the Caribbean, from Caracas to Veracruz and Havana, alternatively as a Greek or Turkish citizen, and by 1928 he had somehow acquired Spanish papers. Ojalvo, meanwhile, had arrived in Mexico in 1920 and naturalized in 1926, and he had indeed just come from Paris with his wife in transit for Mexico when he was detained for heroin trafficking in 1931. By 1932, agents of the Judicial Division of Mexico's Health Department labeled Isaac Sevilla a suspicious person, notorious as a drug addict who socialized with elegantly dressed escorts, and who used his upscale retail store in women's clothing as a front for smuggling heroin. Nonetheless, in spite of any suspicions they aroused within Mexico, and even with their arrest record in the United States, both Sevilla and Ojalvo continued to travel between the US, Mexico, and France throughout the 1930s, even though the US government had distributed their name to all of its consulates abroad. And the US actually failed to prosecute the men because they could not be unequivocally linked to the heroin shipments that they had claimed. As improbable as it sounds, their claim of simply getting a shipment for a stranger they had met in Paris proved to be an effective defense. So I have to skip over some of this, but just to say that Jews in Mexico were not associated with drug trafficking in general. They were associated with other types of contraband smuggling, particularly that of textiles, and thus they were able to avoid a lot of the attention that they might have garnered had they been Chinese, who garnered the most attention from the Mexican government for suspicion for the connection in the opiate trade. And indeed, there was only one Sephardi Jew investigated by Mexican officials for potential expulsion due to drug-related activities. This was a 1935 complaint filed in Durango, Mexico, against a woman named Vida Nahum Altalet, who was accused of living in concubinage with her brother and selling drugs out of her clothing store. Investigators decided that this charge likely stemmed from economic competitors, and they did not go further in their complaint or in their investigation of her. So in conclusion, if we move our gaze from the level of the nation or the state to the level of individuals who occasionally left traces as they moved between many states, we can explore the ways in which such individuals become fluent, both literally and figuratively, in multiple languages and legal systems. And at times, this fluency then provides them with the tools necessary to circumvent such systems. The histories of state control on the mobility of certain goods and people highlight how state attempts to solidify national borders and national identities counterintuitively provided the impetus for solidifying transnational diasporic networks of Sephardi Jews and others. If the US sought to prevent the importing of opiates from Turkey into its territory, it forced Sephardi suppliers to turn in part to trust networks of family and co-religionists in Greece, France, the United States, and Mexico to continue previously established trade patterns. Examining the flows of contraband Sephardi goods and people who were now deemed contraband, which often paralleled and relied on legal trade and migratory practices, this sheds light on the novel geographies for the flows of contraband. In contradistinction to American fears in the 1920s and 30s about the origins of narcotics, Mexico was a destination for the flows of illegal goods and people who used the United States as a conduit. These flows also indicate the extent and durability of transnational Sephardi networks that could be mobilized to facilitate trade or migration, and the ways in which such individuals continued patterns of mobility even once their goods or themselves were deemed undesirable. In other words, global political changes, including the implementation of passport and policing regimes, coincided with particularizing nation-building projects that relied on exclusionary citizenship practices. These increasingly cast Sephardi Jews to the uncomfortable peripheries of national imaginings. In response, Sephardi Jews, whether those engaged in the trade of products now deemed contraband, or those simply who sought to reunite with relatives on the other side of the world, became, in the words of novelist Paul Theroux, people in transit, world-class practitioners of self-sufficiency.